Good day, colleagues. My name is NDHLOVU and I'm a postdoc at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa. Thank you all for your attendance. My topic for today is Doing Masculinity, Gang Violence and the Construction of Masculinity in Marginalized Black African Communities. The outline of my presentation is as follows: introduction, methodology, description of study participants, findings and recommendations. Introduction. In South Africa, it has been argued that violence is linked with men, both as victims and as perpetrators. Harmful notions of manhood and what it means to be indoda, muna or real men are some of the drivers of violence. Masculinity alone is not the cause of violence, but the way boys are socialized to become indoda, muna is a factor. As a social and cultural construct, masculinity has different features depending on the context. However, some of the common traits include being physically strong, being a provider and a breadwinner, being a protector. They are socialized to be harsh, violent, ambitious, and not to show any emotions, among others. Young marginalized men who have been emasculated by poverty use violence as an important way to display power and to prove their manhood in their communities. Important to note is that not all young men use violence to construct masculinity. Against this background, this study explores how marginalized township youth gangs construct masculinity. It was conducted in the marginalized ekasi, African townships of Bophelong in Gauteng and Nyanga in the Western Cape. Moving on to the methodology, 36 youth aged between 15 and 35 and 36 informants were purposely sampled. Face-to-face interviews were conducted with all the participants. 18 unemployed youth formed part of focus group discussions. 18 former gang members and the 36 key informants were individually interviewed. Description of study participants. I'll begin with the former gang members. All 18 former gang members were school dropouts and unemployed, except for one who normally does piece jobs in Nyanga. They joined gangs when they were mostly minors, from the ages of 10 to 15. None had a father in their lives and most lived with female guardians, while a few lived in child-headed homes. Their ages ranged from 15 to 35. Some of their reasons for joining gangs, for dropping out of school, included gang involvement, drug addiction, expulsion for drug use or selling drugs, getting shot or stabbed by rival gangs on the school premises. The unemployed youth, the target was 18 unemployed youth, but coincidentally, some of them were unemployed former gang members. All the youth interviewed in Bophelong had a prison record and were abusing some form of substance. In Nyanga, some had a prison record and others did not, and all were recovering drug addicts. In both provinces, the youth were also school dropouts and only 2 lived with both parents. The lowest level of education was of 2 grade 8 dropouts and the highest was of 2 university dropouts. Reasons for dropping out of school included boredom, criminal activities, involvement in gangs, drug abuse, and expulsion for selling drugs, among others. The informants were government, NGO, NPO, academic, and community role players in both provinces. Moving on to the findings. The first theme was exclusion and the construction of masculinity, ekasi. The sub-theme was ekasi, men negotiating exclusion and resulting hopelessness. I'll begin by reading a quote from one participant, namely Mzapopo, a 31-year-old former gang member from Nyanga. It reads, "Then they end up joining gangs. There is a lot of hopelessness. People don't feel like there is a way out of this poverty. People feel like they can't dream in this place. Dreams don't come true, ekasi." Findings show that poverty and exclusion are some of the features of ekasi, and many young men find themselves with very limited access to basic services. Many young participants accordingly noted the poverty, the poor quality education, unemployment, indecent housing, dehumanized communities, shattered dreams that have trapped them in a vicious cycle of poverty, consequently pushing them to a life of gangs and crime. The second sub-theme was men as providers, using gangs and crime to provide. The following is a quote from another participant, 34-year-old Mutsamai, a former gang member from Nyanga, from Bophelong. It reads, "Another factor is poverty. Most of us come from poor families. Parents can hardly make ends meet, so we need to help put food on the table. You go out and look for a job and nothing comes up. What option do you have? Joining a gang is your option. There you can make ends meet. One of the defining factors of indoda in some African cultures is the ability to play the role of provider. A failure to play this role effectively has disempowered many of them, making them feel like they are not men enough. In line with this, many of the young participants shared how a failure to fulfill this role the conventional way has pushed them to the illegal economy. They shared that instead of allowing their circumstances to emasculate them, they hustled through using gangs to prove their manhood. It was shared that in the face of exclusion, young ekasi men use gangs and violence as a platform for doing masculinity. The third sub-theme was indoda, muna, and masculine pride. 35-year-old Lireto, a former gang member from Bophelong, shared, "You feel like you're a man. You feel like you are a real man if your gang is powerful, but there is so much violence." One of the things that stood out during the interviews was the way the young men constantly referred to themselves as or used the word indoda muna to show that as real men there were traits they were not supposed to be linked with or to exhibit. There was a sense of pride or shame when they used the word indoda, depending on whether they managed to fulfill this very important role or not. Also interesting to note was the way they regularly asked questions like indoda enjani, what kind of men, meaning that real men had to adhere to certain norms in order to assert their manhood. The young men felt the need to achieve their manhood through exhibiting the right qualities, as this plays a very important role in how gangs construct masculinity. The second theme was concepts of manhood and violence, and the sub-theme was construction of masculinity through extreme levels of violence. Bex, a 15-year-old former gang member from Nyanga, had this to say, "We had guns, we had bigger knives, we were the top dogs. I had become very dangerous and more violent. I was not afraid to use my knife." Research suggests that men who have lost their manhood through poverty are prone to use violence as their way of retaining their masculinity. Similarly, findings show that in the face of marginalization, youth from Bophelong and Nyanga are pushed towards gangs where they endeavour to be izinja game, top dogs or powerful gangs through the use of extreme levels of violence. They use violence to dominate and subordinate rival gangs in order to maintain their place as the superior men in their communities, and they are encouraged to be very violent, untouchable, emotionless, destructive and bloodthirsty. Among gangs, being indoda or muna is linked with violence, being street smart and being physically strong. The second sub-thing is women as spoils of gang wars. An informant from Bophelong highlighted, they start raping girls around the area. They are told that now they are men, they must test their thing. The rape of women was not discussed in Nyanga, however in Bophelong it was said to be one of the consequences of gang violence. Many participants share that women are victims of gang wars because being indoda or muna was not only confined to rival gangs and wars, it spilled over to sexual violence against women. Gangs in Bophelong are using rape as an instrument of warfare. It emerged that in addition to targeting rival gangs, they are also targeting women and using their bodies as battlefields for constructing masculinity. The last sub-theme is masculine power and dominance. In line with the sub-theme, an informant from Nyanga explained, "Look, in terms of the community, Abafana, the boys, are striking fear. This is about power." Findings show that exhibiting male dominance and power plays an important role in how gangs construct masculinity. And this was done through projecting strength, being risk takers, being tough, assertive, controlling, and subjugating rival gangs, women, and inferior men. In both townships, manhood has to be continually demonstrated before rival gangs and before community members. Moving on to the recommendations. Based on the findings of the study, the following are recommended. It is recommended that the government, in partnership with various role players, for example, NGOs, NPOs, and private sector, create skills development centers and employment opportunities to enhance young people's employability and to improve their quality of life. Secondly, the government, in partnership with local leaders and NGOs, can implement programs with a gender transformative approach that can challenge and question harmful gender norms and expectations, that can engage and teach men and boys to embrace masculinities that promote Ubuntu, for example, that are nurturing, caring, and also able to express their emotions in a positive way. Engage communities to rethink and change the way they socialize men and women. This includes putting an end to all toxic definitions of masculinity, language, and all forms of socialization that propagate violence and male superiority. Ngiyabonga, ke a leboga, ndiyabulela, and thank you.